First, I wanted to start today's webinar off with some information about the Power in Nature Coalition for those who may be joining us today and are unfamiliar with Power in Nature. Power in Nature is a coalition of just under 300 different environmental and tribal organizations, community groups, and land trusts all working together to make 30 by 30 a reality in California. 30 by 30 is both an international and California state codified goal to protect 30% of land and coastal waters by the year 2030. In the chat is a link to sign up for the coalition, receive monthly e-news, keep up to date with California's 30 by 30 initiative, receive information about upcoming grants, and join any of our regional and topical groups like public lands, freshwater, communications, and governmental relations. Today's webinar is hosted by the Far Northern Regional Group of the Power Nature Coalition, and 3 of our coalition members will be presenting today, and 2 will be presenting specifically about Eel River dam removal. Eel River dam removal is one of our most important 30 by 30 projects up here in the far north for fish connectivity. We wanted to provide an opportunity for all our coalition members to learn more about the Eel River, the next big step towards dam removal, and why removing the dams as soon as possible is so important for 30 by 30. Additionally, Cal Wild will be discussing their community vision for the Upper Eel River watershed report that they produced. Presenting first is Alicia Hamann, the Executive Director of Friends of the Eel River. Alicia has been with Friends of the Eel River for about 12 years and previously served as their Administrative Director. She holds a BA in Anthropology with a minor in Business Administration from Humboldt State University. Alicia will be diving into the next steps for dam removal and why dam removal is so urgent. All right, Alicia, I'll hand it off to you.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being with us today. I know many of you have probably heard me talk about dam removal over and over and over again, but I always like to give a little bit of background on the Eel River itself, what makes it so special, and then, of course, the project and what makes it so problematic. So apologies if you have heard this 1,000 times before. Um, The Eel River is the 3rd largest watershed entirely in California. Once the dams are removed, it will be the longest free-flowing river in the entire state. The Eel has, many folks are really familiar with the South Fork because it runs parallel to Highway 101, but the Eel is much larger than that. It drains about 3,600 square miles. It's got, these old growth forests, oak savannas, massive boulder fields in the upper reaches of many of the tributaries. One thing that I really like to note these days is that about 50% of the land in the watershed is privately owned, but that number really matters in context. When I first started working for Friends of the Eel River, it was a little over 80% privately owned. So we've seen a lot of new public lands developed in the Eel watershed, which of course aligns with the 30 by 30 goals. Of course, before settlers arrived in the Eel, it was home to a wide variety of native people, including Wiyot, Wailaki, Yuki, Pomo, and so many others. Um, Despite the horrible violence and systemic destruction of their cultures, many of these native people still call the Eel home and are doing really excellent work to revitalize the watershed and their way of life. So one thing the eel is well known for is the historic abundance of its fisheries. Cannery data from the 1850s tells us that there were about 1 million anadromous fish coming into the watershed every year. Most of that was Chinook, about 800,000 Chinook every year, and steelhead and coho populations reached about 100,000 annually. And I like to note too that this is at a time when we were already taking a ton of fish from the watershed. So, big picture, the eel has the ability, or at least did in the past, to produce a massive amount of fish. Today, Chinook and steelhead entering the watershed to spawn, they number in like the tens of thousands. We're kind of on an upward trajectory right now, which is really exciting. Coho, unfortunately, they are they need a lot, they need colder water. They're more susceptible to things like toxins that come from tires. And frankly, they're doing a lot worse than the other anadromous fish. So dam removal is a root cause of fisheries decline and is the single most important restoration action we can take to advance fisheries recovery. Oh, and look, there was a little more information on there. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about why dam removal is urgent, and that can mostly be summarized by dam safety, unreliable supply, which is the water supply to the Russian River, and salmonid recovery. So let's talk a little bit about the project. This here is a map of kind of the upper part of the Eel River. And, one thing for people who aren't familiar with the watershed, one thing to note is that the Eel flows from south to north. So when I'm talking about going upstream, for those of you who are in northern Humboldt like I am, I'm actually talking about like down from where we are. So, just orient yourselves a little bit. Some of you might be familiar with the project based on the location of Lake Pillsbury Reservoir. It's due east of Ukiah, about 20 miles, or I guess due east of Willits, located off of Highway 20. And the project has been owned by PG&E since the 1930s. There are two dams and a mile-long diversion tunnel that goes through a mountain to a now defunct powerhouse, and then sends water into the Russian River. So as you travel upstream on the main stem Eel River, as the fish do, the first dam you come to is this one here. It's Cape Horn Dam. It was built in 1908. The reservoir there is called Van Arsdale Reservoir, and it does have a fish ladder, but it's quite problematic, which I'll discuss a little later. Just upstream from Cape Horn Dam is where the diversion tunnel is located. And one thing I want to note, and we'll talk about this a little later too, but it's been kind of misreported in the media. There are plans to continue the diversion after dam removal, and they will use much of the existing infrastructure, including the existing tunnel or system of tunnels and penstocks. So just important to note that no, they are not building a huge new mile-long tunnel. So if you continue about 12 miles upstream from Cape Horn and the diversion site, you'll come to Scott Dam. It was built in 1922, and it impounds Lake Pillsbury Reservoir, and there is no fish passage here, so the fish are stopped abruptly at this dam. One thing to note about the reservoir is that the current usable capacity of the reservoir is about like 4,600 acre feet. I'm sorry, 46,000 acre feet. That's factor difference there. The original storage capacity was much larger, like I think about double that. But between sedimentation, filling up the reservoir, and recent mitigations for dam safety and reliability, trying to make sure that the only low-level water outlet doesn't get clogged up, the storage capacity is now about half of the original volume. For comparison, Lake Shasta, which is the largest reservoir in the state, has a storage capacity of about 4.5 million acre feet. So, we're talking not a whole lot of water here for comparison of, what's available throughout the rest of the state. The main fact driving PG&E's interest in dam removal is that the project has long been a money loser. When it was used to generate electricity, it cost PG&E, or really ratepayers, roughly $20 for every $1 worth of electricity that was generated. And of course, today the project generates no electricity and no revenue at all. So the federal agency that regulates hydropower is called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. I always love to make little jokes about, FERC being a four-letter word, so excuse me if you hear one of those puns pop out later. FERC is also responsible for regulating gas lines and other energy infrastructure. They are focused on energy infrastructure. And so the fact that they are now managing or overseeing this project that really acts as a water supply project, and also has, all these significant harms to fisheries is kind of concerning because that is by no means their area of expertise. FERC licenses hydropower projects usually for 50 years at a time, and so when a license expires, it can be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to enact change at a project. So there are a lot of reasons why removal of Scott Dam has long been inevitable. This includes concerns about safety and reliability, cost of regular operations and upgrades, and of course, ecosystem impacts. I want to start by emphasizing that dam safety has been a significant focus for Friends of the Eel River over the last 15 to 20 years. We've always held that the seismic instability coupled with the aging infrastructure and a variety of issues with the dam's construction pose a pretty serious risk to safety and reliability of the project. The California Division of Safety of Dams gives dams a hazard rating based on potential downstream impacts to life and property in the event of a dam failure when the reservoir is full. And because Scott Dam is likely to cause fatalities downstream, it's classified as a high hazard facility. Much of the information that the public could use to assess these dam failure risks, as well as the emergency action plans for the region, are classified by PG&E as critical energy infrastructure information. And they're concealed from the public. So it makes it really difficult to get a very accurate picture of, what the concerning elements here are. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail today on the various dam safety elements. We're kind of limited on time, but I do just want to emphasize a few things. Oops. And the first of which is that the design of the project was really, faulty from the beginning. You may have noticed that Scott Dam has this sharp angle near the south abutment. Most dams go straight across the river. This one has a weird angle. Originally, it was supposed to go straight across the river, but during construction, engineers realized that what they thought was bedrock with where they were going to attach the dam is actually a giant boulder that moved during construction. And so they did a kind of seat of the pants redesign and ended up building the dam to go right in front of that giant boulder. And then some hilarious genius on the engineering geology maps decided to name the boulder the Knocker. So that boulder is still there, and it's also adjacent to a slowly moving landslide. So both a significant mass of land and this giant boulder are slowly shifting down toward the dam all the time. Um, the Eel is basically the most sediment-heavy river in the lower 48. It's the sediment there has been accumulating behind the two reservoirs for over a century, and it's placing significant pressure on the upstream slope of Scott Dam. In these maps, the one there's one that shows the entire reservoir, and then another one that's kind of a zoomed up look at the reservoir just behind Scott Dam. The darker blue areas show where water is deeper, and the green areas show where sediment has accumulated. I show these to kind of help explain that there are these underwater walls of sediment that have accumulated in the dam, and kind of there's like an underwater river almost that goes toward the dam where the water is released. But what's concerning about that, especially for PG&E, is that those walls of sediment have accumulated up to the level of where the only remaining low level outlet is for the dam. Um, this is why PG&E can never fully empty the reservoir, because they're concerned that if water is drawn down too quickly, or if too much of the sediment is exposed and dried out, that it could collapse and block this only water outlet. If that happens, diversions, like any water flowing below Scott Dam would cease immediately. That means both to the Eel and then ultimately to the Russian. Of course, the Eel has other inputs that come into the system farther south. But this is a good example of why when you hear Friends of the Eel, especially talk about the dams being unsafe, we also talk about them being unreliable as a water supply project. There are other issues, of course. The structures are 100 years old. So with any aging infrastructure like that, there's bound to be some structural issues that begin to arise. There are questions about the reliability of the foundation and how accurately PG&E is monitoring that. For a while, the piezometers that measure uplift pressure were totally offline. I do believe that they installed new ones in 2018, but again, it's hard to see much of this information because it is classified. So here's a picture of the downstream face of the dam, and you can see the water squirting out at the bottom there at that low level water outlet. So all of these issues are compounded by geologic hazards. Many dams were built before we really understood plate tectonics, and so they were situated directly on fault lines because that's the point at which river channels are often pinched and naturally most narrow. This is exactly the case for Scott Dam. The Bartlett Springs Fault is part of the San Andreas complex, and this particular fault is capable of generating up to a magnitude 7 earthquake. In addition to Scott Dam's precarious location, basically directly on top of this fault, let's see if I got a map. I've got kind of a fuzzy map here. There is also an active landslide adjacent to the southern abutment of the dam, as I mentioned before, where that knocker is located. Miller Pacific Engineering did a slope stability analysis for us back in 2018, and they concluded that the landslide, which has a mass of over 8 million cubic feet and weighs over 520,000 tons, it turns out it presents a significant geologic hazard. So then finally, the project helps invasive species. The Sacramento pike minnow are an invasive species in the eel, and they thrive in the warmer, slower waters that you find in a place like a reservoir. Um, they not only compete with native fish for habitat and resources, they also predate on native fish. And so it's not uncommon to find pike minnow with bellies full of baby steelhead. Because they thrive in the ecosystem created by the dams, wildlife experts have acknowledged that dam removal is one of the best things we can do to address the growing population of pike minnow. I'm not going to get into it, but I always like sharing this picture here. It's many years ago, I went out with some scientists who were measuring these series of roughs to see if steelhead would be able to, jump up here and access the habitat up behind these boulders. This is an area called Bloody Rocks Roughs, and it's upstream from Scott Dam. And it turns out that yes, steelhead are incredible athletes and could definitely jump these rocks. And then finally, I just want to touch on the mercury toxicity issue. Please never consume any fish that are caught in the Lake Pillsbury Reservoir. In a 2014 study, statewide study, the fish with the highest recorded mercury in the entire state came from Lake Pillsbury. Mercury naturally methylates in anaerobic environments like reservoirs, but then that makes it biologically available. And so it can bioaccumulate and it works its way up the food chain. And then it presents real dangers for predators or any human who might consume fish caught in the reservoir. Again, experts have acknowledged that dam removal is really the best solution to address this toxic problem. And I will note too that initial sediment coring has shown that the sediments in the reservoir are not contaminated with mercury, which really makes dam removal a lot easier. So I mentioned that the fish ladder at Cape Horn Dam is quite problematic. PG&E is motivated to remove this project based on the longstanding economic losses as well as the dam safety risks. But groups like Friends of the Eel River, CalTrout, we're really most motivated by the opportunity to restore fish passage and remove the harms caused by the dams. So Cape Horn Dam fish ladder, it's really inadequate. It needs pretty extensive upgrades. State and federal wildlife agencies, along with NGOs like us, hold that the fish ladder actually causes take of ESA listed species. Take is a legal term under the Endangered Species Act, which means to harm, harass, capture, kill listed species. So anything you're doing from, all the way from like interfering with reproduction or migration, all the way up to killing them, that's all considered take. This slide illustrates some of the many ways that Cape Horn Dam causes take. It serves as kind of an all-you-can-eat buffet for terrestrial predators. They've got really easy access to the fish as they're struggling up the ladder. It causes warmer temperatures in the reach between the two dams, and that is both problematic on its face for the native fish, but it also makes competition with and predation by pike minnow a larger problem there. And then the fish ladder is also notorious for getting clogged by debris at high flow. I believe that there are some solutions that have been implemented there. We haven't seen it get closed now for a couple of winters, but that used to be a really common occurrence that just about every winter they'd have to close it at high velocity flows. To their credit, PG&E has made a pretty solid effort over the last couple of years to address the temperature issues. And the way that they're doing that is by trying to hold more water in Lake Pillsbury Reservoir to hold on to a deep pool of cold water so that when they release the water from the reservoir, it's not mixing with the water that's been artificially warmed in that big pool. However, they have to get permission from FERC to do this every single year. Some years FERC gives that permission quickly, and PG&E is pretty successful in maintaining temperatures that are suitable for native fish. But other years, FERC inexplicably will take the entire season to grant permission. So this chart here shows in blue in 2022. FERC issued permission for PG&E to reduce diversions to the Russian River to slow the amount of water that they're releasing from Lake Pillsbury Reservoir. And you can see that it was pretty effective in like these little dots up here are showing the temperature. The temperature kind of evened out once the diversions were reduced. You can see in the blue where it kind of dips down on those lines at the bottom. However, in 2023, it was kind of the opposite situation. FERC waited the entire year to give that permission, and we saw temperatures soar to a level that was like just about lethal for the fish. This red line, I inserted that here to kind of show you where that 22 degrees mark is that makes the temperatures become lethal. So unfortunately, this year, FERC once again took their time in approving the requested flow variance. And it was approved just maybe about 2.5 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. But temperatures below Scott Dam had already reached a pretty high level. So we are concerned about the condition that native fish are going to be in this year. So finally, the really hopeful part of this story is, what it's going to look like to bring native fish home to this really excellent upper basin habitat. The inaccessible portion of the upper basin is about 10% of the entire watershed, but importantly, it's some of the best habitat in the entire watershed. Again, I'm not going to spend a great amount of detail on this today, but I think it's important for people to understand that a number of really reputable studies have evaluated the habitat behind Scott Dam, and those studies emphasize that the water stays cold even in the hottest summers, and that the geomorphic features make for really great habitat for all freshwater life stages of a variety of species. So it is truly wonderful habitat. This includes for summer steelhead. These are unique fish that enter freshwater much earlier than other salmonids, and they're able to reach habitat farther upstream than a lot of other anadromous fish. And genetic analysis has shown that some of the resident trout who were trapped behind Scott Dam, those fish are actually descendants of summer steelhead. And so that just like gives us a lot of hope that their offspring could once again pick up that life history and essentially become summer steelhead once the dams are removed. We just need to give them access to salt water again. So the big takeaway for fisheries recovery is that dam removal both eliminates a number of problems and undesirable conditions, but also opens opportunity for native fish to return to some really excellent habitat and reconnect summer run genetics to the sea. I'm going to talk briefly about the diversion. So the out-of-basin diversion from the Eel to the Russian has been in place since Cape Horn Dam was built in 1908. Before then, Potter Valley was a dry farming community, and Potter Valley is the community right at the base of the diversion tunnel. They're the very first people to receive that water. But of course, once they started getting this abundant supply of water, their economy really changed a lot. Um, What's most problematic about the diversion these days is not the quantity of water, but the timing of the diversion. Because Potter Valley doesn't store the water, they receive contract water from PG&E when they need it most, which is in the summer and fall, and that's when the eel can least afford to spare the flows. This graph just shows, real basic breakdown of historic diversions and current diversions. I say that the timing of the diversion is what's most problematic these days. For a long time, it was the quantity of the diversion. For like the first 90 years of the project, we saw 150,000 acre feet diverted every year. This year, it's closer to about 40,000 acre feet. And that's due, it's due to a variety of factors. The fact that the project stopped generating electricity and there are bypass channels that are restricted that have to be used, due in part to efforts to protect native fish. As I was saying, PG&E tries to maintain a significant cold water pool in Lake Pillsbury Reservoir. And also in part to mitigate dam safety risk. I didn't mention this before, but in 2023, PG&E decided to reduce the capacity of the reservoir by about 20,000 acre feet. They have these gates that sit on top of Scott Dam that they raise so that the capacity of the reservoir is larger. And they got some kind of analysis that looked at seismic vulnerability and some details about the structure. Again, we don't know exactly what that analysis said, but it spooked them enough to force a pretty significant change in the way they manage the project. So Charlie will talk more about the water diversion agreement, but one question we get all the time is about how much the future diversion will be. And this is oversimplifying it a bit because the diversion will be based upon available water in the eel, and it's designed to protect flows and habitat in the eel before anything is diverted. But in an average year, it looks to be probably about 30,000 acre feet. Um, oops. Whoa. So again, Charlie's going to talk more about this, but I thought it would be helpful for folks to hear from Friends of the Eel River because we were not a part of the negotiations. And I think some people are often surprised to learn that we are actually supportive of this water diversion agreement. Um, we would prefer to see the diversion ended entirely. And ultimately, I think that there are metrics in this agreement that push for that to happen in the long term. But for now, we are supporting this agreement. And There's a couple of reasons, but before I get into that, I do just want to kind of for clarity so that people can understand, I want to emphasize that the water diversion and dam removal are two separate but parallel processes. So PG&E's application for license surrender includes also a proposal that's called non-project use of project lands, and that basically carves out the infrastructure and the lands that the Eel Russian Project Authority, who's going to be building and managing the diversion, it carves that infrastructure out of the FERC license so that FERC doesn't have oversight over that project. So, again, oh, sorry, my computer reads that I put my hand up. Sorry about that. Um, but again, Charlie will get into some more detail about that, but they are separate processes, but they are designed to work in parallel. So the reasons why Friends of the Eel supports this water diversion project is first because it unites all of the stakeholders and brings the former opponents of dam removal into supporting dam removal. And that's a really big deal going into the FERC process. It's going to be really helpful to show this federal agency that, again, they're not experts in managing water supply or protecting habitat. We don't want them to have to work hard to understand this project and to seek solutions. We want to give them a solution. And so bringing everyone together to say we all in both basins support this proposal is a really big deal. And second, we feel pretty confident that the flow schedule developed by the technical team will actually protect habitat in the eel and sets appropriate seasonal boundaries. The agreement also includes safeguards against abuses of the diversion and includes provisions for changes to the diversion schedule if monitoring shows unexpected adverse impacts to the eel. And then finally, I just always like to mention that, this agreement returns power to the Round Valley Indian tribes. They will be the ones to hold the water right and then lease it to the water users. And so with the tribe leading restoration of the eel and serving as the future guardians to the water right, we feel really confident that decisions will be made in the best interest of the eel and its fisheries. So I'm going to skip through a couple of things here. Um, just to talk process a little bit, I included this slide not to spend time about talking about where we've been, but only to illustrate that many stakeholders have been discussing the future of this project for nearly a decade. So it really should come as no surprise to anyone that, dam removal is now nearly upon us. So here we are in 2025, and PG&E has just submitted their license surrender application. Over the next several years, PG&E will develop plans with input from stakeholders for things like how to mitigate impacts to the river during dam removal, how to best restore the footprint of the project. They'll also engage with state agencies and secure the necessary permits for dam removal. And in the meantime, FERC will review the license surrender application and hopefully issue a license surrender order in a timely manner. PG&E believes that could happen as early as 2028. So a couple things to note. Yes, PG&E's license surrender application has been submitted to FERC, but FERC has not actually opened the comment period to the public yet. So you can find sample public comments and instructions for commenting to FERC at eelriver.org. I'll put a link in the chat when I'm done here with a specific page where we have that stuff posted. But because FERC hasn't actually opened the comment period yet, we don't have the specific docket number that this needs to be filed to. So we do encourage people to, draft your comments now, register with the FERC system, but then go ahead and wait to submit them until we know exactly the right way to send them to FERC. As I mentioned, coming next, PG&E will spend the next few years developing detailed management and restoration plans. So this will probably include more detailed analysis of sediment composition in the reservoir and modeling to estimate exactly how that sediment is going to move throughout the watershed. Management plans to protect aquatic species during dam removal. There's going to be a period of time there where a good portion of the river is lethal, is uninhabitable. And so we need to really figure out how to time that precisely and do whatever else we can to mitigate impacts. They're going to develop fire mitigation plans to account for the loss of the reservoir as a firefighting resource. And then, of course, all of their restoration plans. Ultimately, the thing that will finally kick off dam removal is, as I mentioned, a license surrender order from FERC. PG&E says this could happen as early as 2028. that would be wonderful. However, I do want to emphasize FERC is a bit of an unpredictable entity, and it's difficult to predict how quickly the commission will act. However, FERC cannot deny a license surrender order, or I'm sorry, a license surrender application. So PG&E has said, we don't want to run this project anymore. FERC can't force them to run it, but they can take 20 years to approve this application. So hopefully they don't, but just, it's just good to be aware of what we're getting into. Um, Once the license surrender order has been issued, then PG&E can schedule dam removal. Their plan is for a process called rapid removal, which will result in like the shortest duration of high suspended sediment in the river and the least amount of impacts to the river. It will take about 2 years if we get the right weather conditions to ensure an adequate flow to flush out all the sediment. And let's see, I think that's about all I wanted to cover. This slide just talks a little bit about like some of the things that we've been doing. There's a coalition called Free the Eel that's been working together for many years. freetheeel.org is our website where you can find a lot of resources. And then that's just some of my contact info there. And I will now pass it off to Charlie to talk about the water diversion agreement and some of the other process items.
I should unmute here. Well, thanks, Alicia. You did. Oops, sharing the wrong thing, aren't I? Hold on. That's what we want. There we go. Yeah, thanks, Alicia. It's funny because I think, well, I see a lot of people I know, so I'll make the same caveat as Alicia. And apologies for seeing some of the same slides you've probably seen before, but obviously this is a project many of us have been working on for, I mean, going on 10 years at this point, I think for some of us. So not me, I'm a little bit newer to the game, but same processes continue. So I'm gonna, rather than kind of repeat things Alicia did, maybe jump around a little bit more and just kind of cover a couple things in terms of process. But want to mention a couple things that Alicia missed. No offense, you covered a lot of ground. One really cool thing about the project, we talk a lot about salmon, CalTrout, it's in the name. This is a really important lamprey river as well. And I was recently talking with the biologist for PG&E that works at Cape Horn Dam, and over 8,000 lamprey passed the dam this year. It's the second year in a row with a really big lamprey run. So we expect dam removal to benefit those guys as well. And then, kind of starting with the beginning, right? Why is PG&E getting rid of this project? Well, ultimately, it's not cost effective. It's uneconomic for them to continue to operate. The facilities haven't created any electricity since 2021 when a transformer in the powerhouse failed. So they really are just losing money on this project, and it's ratepayer money, right? If you buy your power from PG&E, you're paying to maintain this aging project that's not providing any benefit to the company's electricity portfolio. And ultimately, with many of these aging dams across the country, bigger picture, we see that they're pretty inefficient and they're getting more and more expensive as they age. And so a lot of utility companies are making the decision to divest of these facilities. And in some cases, that means selling them or transferring them to another owner. PG&E tried that, no one wanted it. And so that's where we end up where we are, which is with license surrender, which is essentially PG&E telling FERC, hey, we're done with this. We're going to submit a plan to you. You tell us how we can safely decommission these facilities in a way that meets the public interest. And so decommissioning, the plan is proposed by the dam owner, and then FERC will issue the order. And what's one interesting piece of decommissioning is that FERC can actually condition the order. So they can force PG&E to do, or they will force PG&E to do specific things. So you must remove Scott Dam in such and such a way, develop a management plan, send it back to us, we'll sign off on it, and then you can finally go to construction. So it is a little bit of an interesting process in that FERC makes that ultimate decision. And that's, as we talk about providing comments, on the docket, that's what FERC will use to make their decision. And that's all that FERC will use to make the decision. And so it's really incumbent on advocacy groups, the members of the public, water users, everyone to say like this is the public interest associated with this project, and this is why it's important. And then ultimately FERC decides. Um, FERC tends to be pretty utility friendly, I would say. They really care a lot about ratepayer cost and electricity costs. They tend to be pretty industry friendly. But in that case, in this situation, I think that actually benefits those of us that are advocates of dam removal and restored rivers, because PG&E is the one that's made this decision to remove the dams. So Alicia mentioned, there's sort of these two parallel processes, and really this is PG&E's project, their decision, their plan that they've submitted to FERC. And essentially what outside parties have done is come into PG&E with a proposal to maintain a portion of the project. And I'll talk more about that, but that was the Eel Russian Project Authority that put that proposal into PG&E a little less than 2 years ago. That group, I'll explain the composition of it, but we'll start with where PG&E is at, which is with submitting this decommissioning plan, this license surrender and decommissioning plan. And their plan is to remove both dams and then allow for what's called a non-project use of project lands, which essentially takes you can think of the project as a polygon on a map. It takes a portion of that polygon out of the FERC license and hands it over to another entity. And so this is often used for things like campgrounds. You can imagine there's a utility-owned campground on a reservoir somewhere, and utility doesn't want to manage it anymore. They'll hand that campground over to another entity, and they have to ask FERC for permission to do that. So PG&E's plan is this license surrender plan: remove the dams, develop management plans around things like revegetation, how to manage birds during the construction, those sort of things. And then this non-project use of project lands. I already mentioned this. So removing both dams, removal and site restoration of some of the campgrounds, day use of facilities. There's all sorts of appurtenant facilities associated with a project of this size. And then some of those they'll make safe and either remove them or leave them in place. A good example might be a road that doesn't get used, right? Is it worth going in and doing restoration, or are they better off just leaving it? So PG&E will make those determinations on how they restore the site. And then this non-project use of project lands component is really the diversion component. And so the Eel Russian Project Authority, which includes Sonoma Water, Mendocino Inland Water and Power Commission, and it's a joint powers authority between those two entities. Round Valley Indian Tribes also has a seat on the board, so they're included but not in the JPA. Put in a proposal to PG&E to take a portion of those facilities, transfer them to the Eel Russian Project Authority, or ERPA, since we love fancy acronyms. And then ERPA will build a new diversion facility and then utilize PG&E's existing diversion structure and tunnel to continue diversions into the Russian River. So when that proposal originally went into PG&E, CalTrout, the other signatories of the WDA were not a part of it. It was just those three initial parties. And several of us were invited back to the negotiation table because the ERPA folks knew that this wasn't a solvent measure without Eel River interest support. And in large part, that's because FERC really wants people to sort out the problems on their own and not be the litigator or the judge on these sort of regional issues. And so FERC really wants the project owner to work with stakeholders on solutions to particular issues associated with decommissioning. And so this non-project use of project lands is really narrowly focused. It's solely focused on the diversion structure, and it doesn't, other than through the site of the new diversion structure, doesn't really touch on the other components of the project, including things CalTrout really cares a lot about, like bed restoration or other components. So solely focused on the diversion. And these are the groups that came back together, including California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which really helped in large part as a facilitator role amongst these parties to reach an agreement of how this new diversion could get built in the Eel River and gain the support of Eel River parties for it. So it's really based on work started years ago by Congressman Huffman as part of the ad hoc, and then a separate effort that was moved forward that CalTrout was a part of to actually acquire the license for the project to do something similar here. But it's really been based on 5-6 years of work, several $1 million in studies to see what's feasible and affordable for water users here. knowing that water users would really like to keep, some amount of water diverted to the Russian River to sort of prevent a shock to water supplies. Um, Alicia touched on some of the components, but essentially what we've all agreed to is a water diversion agreement. It includes support for this new diversion facility. Uh, it has a term, so 30-year initial term and a 20-year additional term if certain conditions are met. As Alicia mentioned, the intent of the WDA parties is for the water rights to be owned by RVIT, Round Valley Indian Tribes. And I'll mention here that PG&E has not agreed to that, right? Like we are proposing this effort to PG&E. They've been supportive enough to include the non-project use of project lands in their surrender application, but those negotiations around real property like the water rights are yet to come. But thus far they've been supportive. And Alicia touched on that, the water that's coming out of the Eel River really started with scientific work created by consultants to Round Valley Indian tribes, and started from a place is what does the Eel River need to have a functional ecosystem, right? And so the goal here is that any diversion could not negatively impact recovery of Eel River fisheries. And that's not just minimum flows. We're talking flows that will actually support recovery of these fish that, haven't been doing well for the past 100 years. And I'll kind of skip over this because Alicia touched on it, but all parties agree to support dam removal with no delay, which is really important to Eel River constituency. Payment to Round Valley for lease of what will become their water rights, and then an additional restoration payment for the Eel River for fisheries restoration. And there's also this principle of funding equity between the two basins. So every dollar we spend building a new diversion, this group will spend another dollar on restoration in the Eel River. And I think that's really important for the equity of this project long term. As I often mention, this is a project that one basin had all the impacts and the other basin had all the benefits. And so this really helps to reset that balance. And we've been, as I mentioned earlier, CDFW has been really supportive, bringing sort of non-traditional partners together to work through some really tough issues, and historic harms. These have been fraught negotiations, but, we ultimately came together in February to sign an MOU and then recently made that binding with this water diversion agreement. And CDFW has agreed to support us with funding. So $9 million to build a new diversion and $9 million for Eel River Restoration Fund to go towards fisheries restoration. I always end on this photo just because I think it's cool. This is Gravelly Valley. So this is what's under Lake Pillsbury pre-Scott Dam going in. Many of you have seen this. It's my favorite picture, but we can do Q&A there, I guess. Have a Q&A slide, but we'll end on this one and take any questions folks have. Oh, I was going to hand it off to Mark. This is a good segue for Mark. This is what I meant to do. Mark and Cal Wild have been working on a vision for this upper watershed, right? People care a lot about this watershed. You've kind of heard the fish people side of it, but there's a lot more folks that care a lot about Mendocino National Forest, where this reservoir is located. And if the dams do come out, it's going to be a big change, right? This is a big change for our region, no matter how you look at it, right? So what do we do in the face of change? Well, I like to try to seize the opportunity, and I think that Cal Wild's done a really good job of working with stakeholders to start thinking about what are those opportunities we can seize in light of these big changes coming to our region.
Great. Well, thank you, Charlie. I appreciate that. When we talk, as the presentations have proceeded today, one of the things that you'll notice as recurring themes are fish and water diversions and fish, right? That has been the bulk of the conversation that has happened around management or elimination of the dams on the Eel. And there are other issues. And there are stakeholders who have felt that they have not been included in conversations, or that they're going to be the losers in all of this. We were approached, Cal Wild was approached by Representative Mike Thompson and asked to engage with Lake County to do something that kind of softens the blow for those that feel like they're going to be losers in the event of the elimination of the Lake Pillsbury Reservoir. So we took a kind of unusual approach. we decided that organizationally we would be neutral about the dam removal so that we could work with stakeholders on all sides of that question. And we were able to engage with people very polarized. There are a lot of organizations and individuals on this call that have been involved in conversations with us about this. Friends of the Eel for sure, CalTrout for sure, Tuliomi, as well as with groups like the Lake Pillsbury Alliance and some of the homeowners, some of the chambers of commerce, the County of Lake. So we put together and conducted over about an 18-month period a long, slow, careful community engagement process that allowed all of those stakeholders, including many tribes, to contribute their thoughts about what they would like to see happen in the future. We compiled all of those into a report, which you can now download at this website, which is up here, eelcommunityvision.org. I'll put it in the chat again in case people missed it the first time. It's not super long, but it talks about fire resilience. It talks about terrestrial restoration as opposed to aquatic restoration. It talks about recreation. It talks about tribal concerns. And we're not speaking for the participants in this process. We don't claim to do that. What we're doing is reporting what we heard. And the idea is that this is kind of a shopping list, a vision for what can happen, whether or not the dams come out, for all of those different axes like fire resilience and recreation and all those kinds of things. Some of the projects could not happen if the dams do come out. Some of the projects could not happen if the dams don't come out. But the idea was to get beyond that single point of contention to bring people together around a vision that elected officials can go out and advocate for funding for, and that can help to sort of organize a better future for the upper watershed of the Eel and the Mendocino National Forest. So that really is the entire project. We were funded by the State Coastal Conservancy and the Resources Legacy Fund. And I'm happy to answer any questions about it.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was really helpful and really great that y'all have a website to dispense the report. That's amazing.
Thank you.
We can take questions for any of the presenters and any of the material that was discussed today. You can either pop your questions in the chat or raise your hand or just unmute and ask away. Teresa?
Yeah, I have a question about this 30,000 acre feet, which is predicted to be what it will be if the diversion goes through and the dams come down, correct? I think Alicia said that or Charlie, I can't remember. So how different is that from now? Like what we're seeing in the Russian River now, like I just crossed it today in Healdsburg. It looks kind of low. How much is getting into the Russian River right now? Can you actually name that in acre feet?
Yeah, it's as I understand it, it's about 40,000 acre feet. The last what year is it now? 2025. Like the last 3 or 4 years. That's about how much it's been, about 40,000 acre feet. It's hard to put an exact number on it because there's a great deal of the kind of rules that will determine what the diversion will be. Those vary by season and essentially there's always has to be a minimum flow in the eel that the eel needs to remain healthy before any diversions can start. So the main difference is the seasonality of when the diversion will happen because the eel has water to spare in the wintertime, and so that's when we'll see the bulk of the water diverted. Charlie, you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's just, I guess I would say it's complicated for a couple of reasons. You essentially have those that work on hydropower will understand RPA, reasonable and prudent alternatives. But essentially, both Scott and Cape Horn Dam, the Potter Valley Project, and Lake Mendocino have set diversion rules that they have to operate under. So like let this much, when the reservoir is this full, you have to dump water for flood control, right? Lake Mendocino is primarily a flood control reservoir. Those that live in the Russian are probably aware of FIRO. This sort of lets them more flexibly manage that. And so you kind of have these separate constraints, right? Water that comes through the pipe from the Eel doesn't necessarily go down the Russian at like 1-to-1, right? It's restored in Lake Mendocino, and the rules of Lake Mendocino are not governed by the Potter Valley Project anymore. Sonoma Water has separated that management. So the goal of the updated diversion is really to keep Lake Mendocino reliably full in the wintertime, fill it up, top it up in the spring and winter, and then allow the biological opinion in the Russian to monitor to meter those flows back down the Russian. So the goal, the easier way to think about this is not X thousand acre feet, because some of that historic 150,000 that moved over to the Russian, they just let that right out of Lake Mendocino. And even under high flows, like you could actually be increasing, could be 20,000 CFS in the Russian, and no one's using that water in the middle of the winter, right? So the timing of the water is really important if you're thinking as a farmer or a water user. But really the goal, and I think that the key thing to key on, is how reliable will Lake Mendocino be? And our partners at Sonoma Water tell us it's going to be pretty darn similar to what it is now. Remembering, of course, that they're governed by a brand new biological opinion in the Russian River that actually, slightly reduces flows in the main stem Russian River in the summer from historic rates. And that's because fish aren't adapted to tons of water in the summer around here, right? Like everyone, in Northern California, our natural hydrology is wet winters, dry summers. So a bunch more water in the summer isn't necessarily the best thing for the ecology of the Russian River. Now, of course, there's also some other concerns, recreation, water users, et cetera. But the key thing to think about is how reliable is Lake Mendocino in all of this.
Okay, yeah, I was just thinking about talking to people when I talk to just regular people about this. I'm always going, well, it's a lot less than it used to be. So like what you're seeing now might be what the river's going to look like during the summer, but maybe that's not true, given what you just said.
And we'll never go back to what it was. I mean, we all use those charts of showing it go down over. It'll never be 150,000 acre feet, and it'll never be 60,000 because we can't put up PG&E can't put up the radial gates on Scott Dam anymore, and they can't. The top and the bottom of Scott Dam are being pinched by aging infrastructure, essentially, right? So that total storage volume in Lake Pillsbury has effectively been cut in half. And that's part of what makes this project less economically viable for PG&E. Their reservoirs getting old and not working the way it used to.
Okay, thank you.
One of the questions I see in the chat is what were the main objections to this project and how are they addressed? And I'm assuming that that's referring to both dam removal and the diversion. I will say one of the slides that I sometimes use that I skipped over this time is a slide that shows all the stakeholders who began this process of discussing this project way back in 2017 when PG&E actually was planning on relicensing it. As Charlie mentioned, they ended up giving that up and then they tried to auction it and sell it, and we went through this whole thing. But even way back then, we had Lake County, Humboldt County, Sonoma County, Mendocino County. We had all these NGOs, we had tribes, we had agencies, like tons and tons of entities came together almost 10 years ago now to start discussing what the future of this project would look like. So over that long period of time, there have been a lot of studies that went into like, can we keep Scott Dam? Can we build a fish ladder over it? How much would it cost? Would it be technically feasible? What's the sediment composition like? What kind of flows are needed in the Russian River to provide not only for agricultural and other water uses, but also for like managing in-stream flows. So a lot of studies went into answering these various questions. At this point, I think that there remains objections from folks who live around Lake Pillsbury and recreate in the reservoir there. It's a big change that is going to be really difficult for for folks to wrap their minds around. And I think that part of the way that those concerns are being addressed is through the process that Mark described, that Cal Wild did, to really, really truly listen to people and understand what their concerns are, and how they can be addressed. And ultimately, I'll say the blunt and honest thing here. If those concerns are, I want a reservoir still, there is not going to be a solution for that. What folks will have is probably a beautiful meadow, a wild and scenic river, hopefully abundant native fish. But there are some things that just aren't possible with the way that this project is going. And then related to the water diversion, like I said, I think there were concerns about equity, how much is being paid to Round Valley for lease of that water, how much is being paid into the Eel Restoration Fund. And there were a lot of lengthy negotiations that I think Charlie could probably speak to better than I can. But I just really like to emphasize that there were a lot of divisive interests that worked really hard to come together on this, and that's, I think, pretty remarkable.
Thanks, Alicia. That was really comprehensive. Another question, somebody was wondering how fish are doing in the Middle Fork without dams and with roughly the same size watershed.
It's a pretty different watershed, I would say. We know the Middle Fork's kind of the last stronghold one of the last couple strongholds for Eel River summer steelhead. I haven't heard the numbers this year, but they tend to be in the 200 to 300 range. So it's not great. I'm not sure we know good historic numbers. Overall, fisheries monitoring the eel, especially in like the Middle Fork, which is super remote, there just hasn't been a lot of it. And so CalTrout, CDFW, Trout Unlimited, and Round Valley Indian tribes have been running these sonar cameras in the Eel River for we're on our 7th year now. It's really the first time we've had a comprehensive look at fisheries in the eel. I would say, sort of big picture, one of the things we're learning is seeing a fair number of Chinook moving up the main stem Eel River. They're not necessarily going into the Middle Fork. We're a little confused on where they're going. They're likely main stem spawning. So yeah, hard to say, but I guess the other thing I would say is it is a bit of a different watershed. It does have some of those same high elevation attributes, but I think the modeling done by National Marine Fisheries Service and others suggests that the upper Eel River is more conducive to salmonid production than some of the places of the Middle Fork.